Today on CityCast DC, we are talking about DC's brand new police chief and its no longer quite so new surge in crime. We're also talking about the future of ranked choice voting in DC and about where to watch the Women's World Cup. This is a cool city to do so. I'm joined by Dan Reed and CityCast's own Julia Karron. Today is Friday, July 21st. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. So her name is Pamela Smith. She is actually already an employee of the Metropolitan Police Department, although not a career lifer the way the last few chiefs have been. She, for the last year and change, has been a part of the MPD. She had been the chief of the United States Park Police, which has a fairly big footprint in DC. It is not, the word evokes like park rangers and stuff like that, but it's actually, they have a lot of urban parks and they do kind of regular policing there. But she was brought in to DC, to the Metropolitan Police Department, a little more than a year ago to be the first chief equity officer of MPD. MPD was on the bad end of some lawsuits, including by a bunch of black women police officers who alleged that they had been passed over and otherwise, not treated well. That was sort of her brief when she joined MPD. She then became the assistant chief of Homeland Security here. So it's sort of an interesting balancing act the mayor has. On the one hand, she has staked out the more aggressive anti-crime position, by which I mean to say she has staked out a position that is not favored by the most vocal police reform fund advocates. On the other hand, the person she has promoted to the top is someone that she brought in with the express purpose of making MPD more humane for its own diverse staff and, I think by extension, the general public. So that's sort of where we're at, and all the stories about her and all the conversations about her, and probably including the one we're about to have, deal with the fact that she is taking over against the backdrop of the city's kind of 25-year decline in crime having ended and now having gone way up. Violent crime is up, I think, 36% this year. I don't know how much policing has to do with that, but I don't know. What do you guys think of the appointment and the politics around it?
I think the politics around it are interesting. One of the quotes from the Washington Post piece that I read was that in NPS, she was really kind of stifled by the bureaucracy. Like, she wanted to do more and thought that the whole NPS bureaucracy, because it's Park Service, but also they kind of function as their own police force, got in the way of some of the changes that she wanted to make. So do we think that she can kind of nudge MPD bureaucracy to kind of come to her whims, or do we think she's going to have the same problem that she had at NPS?
This is apropos of nothing. I guess I can't believe it took this long to have a black woman running the MPD.
Oh, yeah, that too.
I can't help but wonder if some of her challenges at NPS are related to that. And so I wonder how much that might repeat itself here.
For sure.
I think you've got a situation in the district where the police department is a higher percentage of black people than the city's population at large. On that front, it's like, by the standards of American police departments, pretty good. It has had a lot of challenges. It's, I've written about potential white nationalist sympathies among members of the force and whether they've done enough to root that out and so on. But I think that the divide in city politics is, do we adopt sort of more headline-grabbingly aggressive tactics about crime to kind of assure people who've had an emotional reaction to the sense that the city's become more dangerous, and that's what makes them scared. It makes people act irrationally. And this crime bill that the council sort of grudgingly but overwhelmingly passed that makes it easier, it creates some new felonies, makes pretrial detention of people accused of violent crimes easier. It's kind of stuff that had been deemed passé not very long ago. So do you embrace that, or do you continue down the path of hey, I don't know that kind of balls out policing actually had much to do with the fall in crime over the last couple decades, and I don't know that we should be going back to it. Proof's in the pudding, but I think it's a pretty savvy appointment, because if this person whose most recent background is in promoting equity in policing, and whose biography, the first black woman police chief, is as a trailblazer, it's hard to caricature this person as like vicious, brutal face of policing. That's not to say that she's incapable of doing vicious, brutal things, but I'm just saying that from a optics point of view, it makes her a little bit tougher to lampoon as a brutal cop.
Yeah.
This is what someone on the left who dealt with Kamala Harris, though, when she was a prosecutor in California.
True. Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that she had mentioned, at least in the opening presser, was that she wants to be more public facing. She wants to be going into communities and asking them specifically, like, what do you want from me? And how can I help you? Help me help you kind of situation. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And so I don't know if that's like a swerve away from the Conti years, if he was as public facing or not. But I think having that goodwill towards constituents and saying, hey, like, I really want to get this under control. I want your input, whether it's like bringing stuff up before council and saying, hey, we should make stuff stiffer penalties, similar to the stuff that we've already passed. Or if people are saying, you know what, this isn't really cutting it. I do think that kind of goodwill towards the people of DC is something, obviously, that is to curry favor. But I think at the same time is, you know, if she wants to make a difference, then like starting from the ground up, I guess is a good way to do so.
You know, it's a complicated conversation. You've got the actual, you know, regular residents who go about their lives. You've got activists on sort of both sides of a bunch of criminal justice policy things. You've got a council who responds both to their constituents and to activists. You've got the police union, and you've got the mayor who hired you. All new chiefs, and I don't want to read too much into any one person, but there's always like with Conti, he joined the MPD when he was 17, so he really like knows the people. Yeah. And in Pamela Smith's case, Bowser said, look, she comes from Arkansas. She's able to look at it with new eyes. And the point is you can, cite their biography to indicate whatever it is you want to indicate. Yeah. I don't, at the end of the day, know how much any of this has to do with the rise or fall in crime. But one of the things a police chief does have to do is maintain a public constituency and support and represent her officers that way.
Hey DC, Bridget Todd here. On this podcast, we work hard to bring you the most important and entertaining conversations happening around our city. But that's not all we do. We also have a daily newsletter that brings you so much more. Our free daily newsletter, Hey DC, is written and curated by Kayla Cote-Stemmerman. You may have heard her behind the mic a couple of times. The Hey DC newsletter is your daily toolkit for being a more informed and engaged citizen of DC. It's packed with recommendations, tips, and secrets for seizing everything that DC has to offer. You can subscribe to Hey DC by texting DC to 66866. That's 66866.
So, Dan, you have a cottage industry of your own, an obsession with ranked choice voting, which is the system in which you, instead of just voting for one candidate, and if you're in a field of 8 candidates, the person you vote for could wind up with like 22% and still win. You list in order of preferences so that by the end of the counting, the person who wins actually has like a majority support. This has been implemented a lot of places, including Alaska, where it's probably responsible for Sarah Palin losing her race, and New York. And now the idea was it was going to come to DC. They put it on the ballot as an initiative, like, should we have this kind of thing? The Democratic Party of DC has opposed this for very understandable reasons, which is the Democratic Party is such an overwhelmingly dominant force that this proposal, which would include open primaries and stuff, would probably lessen the party's institutional power, if not its wins. But this is a thing you have paid a lot of attention to over the years. What do you make of it? Like, I know you live in Silver Spring, but if you were a DC voter, would you want this to be on the ballot, and how would you vote and why?
Ranked choice voting is not just a DC thing, but it's regional now, right? Like Arlington is the first place in the region to have tried it in the primary last month. They're not doing it now for the general because they felt maybe things had moved too fast. And there were concerns that it was confusing to people in less affluent or minority communities. Like, it was harder to do voter outreach. And that was one of the concerns the DC Democratic Party raised as well, right? And that's sort of, I think, one of like the big recurring questions in any kind of like civic or political stuff is it like, how do you reach out to people who are the usual suspects, who vote in every election, who come to every meeting, who know everything that's going on? How much do you actually have to do to help them understand what's going on, right? There was an interesting quote from an ANC commissioner in Ward 7 who also chairing the campaign in support of ranked choice voting in DC. She said, the criticism that ranked choice voting is too complicated is insulting and archaic, right? That maybe it's you talking down to people to say they can't understand what admittedly is kind of a complicated way to vote. But it's the same conversation that's been happening in Arlington, and the city of Rockville in Maryland, which had talked about doing ranked choice voting, is also not going to do it because the mayor there said they think they're not familiar enough with it. So I don't know. Have y'all had a hard time understanding what it is?
No, but let me put this out there. Like, I think that, yes, it is. It seems kind of like insulting to think that this is rocket science, right? You list an order of preference, and your second choice vote has some power if your first choice vote doesn't pan out. It's not that tricky. I do have a part of me that wonders, as we embrace ranked choice voting and other things, that, we're at this moment where there's so much, Trump and so on, like so much conspiracy theory about elections and so much, doubts about the legitimacy of elections. And it wasn't just Trump. It's feeling in various left circles about other elections being messed with. And in some cases, it's not an illegitimate fear. I mean, if you look at the history of discrimination against black voters, it's a very legitimate fear. In that context, is it maybe not a great time to mess with the rules?
When I think of like the folks who are raising concerns about like presidential election, the Stop the Steal folks, they seem like a slightly different crowd than the folks we're talking about here.
Oh, sure. But like, I just mean in general, we're at a moment in our country of like delegitimization of institutions. And I don't think that's a feeling that is limited to the extreme right. And one of the things delegitimize themselves has become confusing and people are quite sure how they work. And when you introduce changes, even if they're basically good changes, it might sometimes add to that confusion. And there's moments where it's like maybe better to not do anything to further confuse. On the other hand, you have these ridiculous primary elections in DC where like 23 people will run for the Democratic Party's nomination to some at-large DC council seat, and the winner will get like 17% of the vote or something. I'm exaggerating, but not that much. And win, quote unquote, the general election because the Democratic nominee is going to win. And then you've got these people who are now elected DC council members with, not that much legitimacy in the sense of like a majority of the electorate having picked them. And that's like a pretty bad status quo too.
Yeah. That too.
Oh yeah. This is where I make my proposal for my preferred kind of election.
Ooh.
You said I was a nerd. It's called a jungle primary or blanket primary. Pick your metaphor. And the way it works is in the primary election, everybody, regardless of party affiliation or independent, is in the primary together. And then instead of having like separate like Republican and Democratic party primaries, and then the top two winners go on to the general. And they've also done this in California. And one of the reasons why I like it for this area is because it is so heavily Democratic, right? That just to your point, Mike, that someone can win the primary with a not majority of the vote or barely even a plurality, very small share, and go as a Democrat, right? And then go into the general against a Republican who will lose because they are Republican and don't really have a mandate. This is a recurring problem in Montgomery County, where for the past two elections, the county executive has been reelected with the tiniest margin of votes, right? In a jungle and or blanket primary, I think of it as like continuing the conversation in the general, as opposed to just sort of having, an election that isn't totally used to its full potential.
Do you think DC or Montgomery County or Virginia, after this like trial run with like ranked choice voting, do you think that they would try a jungle style primary, or do you think that they would have some of the same excuses where like, oh, it's too complicated if everyone votes at once, we're used to doing it the old fashioned way? Dan, what do you think would happen?
I think it's too complicated, but I think the same way that the Democratic Party is fighting ranked choice voting in DC, it's logical the Democratic Party would not want jungle primaries, because also means Republicans and unaffiliated voters are voting in the primary with everybody else. And that dilutes the Democratic Party's power and influence, even though the likelihood is very strong that you would have two Democrats in the fall running against each other. So I imagine it would probably end up very similarly.
All right, you want to know my worthy proposal?
Do it.
Totally
Let's hear
different.
it.
Blow this up. It's a worthwhile Canadian initiative. My wife is a known Canadian. Up there, as I understand it, there are different, like legally different entities, different political parties at the city level and at the province level and at the national level. So like you could both be members of the Democratic Party when it came to national politics. But in DC, you know, we could have a like DC like super progressive party and a DC centrist party. And by national standards, members of both would probably be fairly to the left on the Democratic Party. But it would represent kind of truth in advertising. Because right now, like we who are nerdy for city politics, like we can tell you who the progressive bloc is in the DC Council, who the more centrists are on the DC Council. But a regular, you know, not especially well-informed voter, just looking at their party ID, would be clueless about this because they are almost all Democrats. And if you could actually like oblige the, you know, just because you happen to agree that like Biden is better than Trump doesn't mean you agree about like what the best budget for DC is or the best way of doing policing in DC is. If we could somehow unconstitutionally forbid organizations, if you could somehow create a system where there's like different parties locally, people would know what they're voting for. And I think that would basically be like a good thing and avert a lot of these sort of people getting into office without much of a mandate.
Yeah, I like that a lot too. You know, if I lived in DC, I would register for the Mike Schaefer party.
Who among us would
for
not?
the Dan Reed party.
Exactly.
I think the Dan Reed party would do a lot better.
Oh yeah, Dan Reed party would crush.
I'm flattered.
All right, so speaking of parties, hey, I've been looking for a good transition. It is World Cup season again. And DC is such a cool place to do your watching because there's all these embassies and a large international population, you know, really all kinds of countries that have large immigrant populations as well as countries that don't. And they often sponsor events that you can do. So if you could watch the World Cup in a true Norwegian style or something like that, Julia has been looking at where to watch, how to watch. What is cool out there? What should we do?
Okay, so I feel like this requires a little bit of prefacing. So this year's World Cup is in Australia and New Zealand. And as you might know, their timetable is flipped from ours. So a lot of the games are happening at 3 in the morning. Now, to solve this problem, Kenyon McDuffie passed legislation saying DC bars can be open 24/7 and serving alcohol. You know, we'd love to see it. So if you're looking for some embassy type stuff, it might not be in their best interest to be open at 3 in the morning with a bunch of drunkards roaming around trying to watch the game. Because most of these games are at 3 in the morning, I would check each individual embassy's website to see if they're having a watch party at 3 a.m. A lot of embassies in the past have done watch parties when the games are at like 9 p.m. or 7 p.m. or at a timetable that's a little more favorable to us Americans. So I would check with your embassy of choice, embassy of flavor, if you're looking for the match that you're interested in. If you're just wanting to go and watch at a bar, because of all of the legislation that got passed where you can watch at 3 a.m., there are so many options. so many options. So like Boundary Stone in Bloomingdale is including like staying open until 3 a.m. DC time. There's going to be like a breakfast menu there, and happy hour beers will be available at 3 in the morning. So if that is your vibe, go to Boundary Stone, apparently. There are official watch parties as well. So the Washington Spirit, which is the local NWSL team in the area, their official watch party is at the Bullpen. It's that little like outdoor complexy area right outside Nationals Park. They will have a huge watch party there. Additionally, the American Outlaws, which is the fan group for the U.S. women's and men's national teams, it's the supporters group. Their official bar is Astro Beer Hall down near Metro Center. That is where I will be going tonight when the USA plays Vietnam at 9 p.m. So say hi if you're going to be there. If you're looking for something else, as you are, which is the Queer Cafe and Bar on Capitol Hill, they're going to have a lot of the games over the next 2 weeks. So like the U.S. plays the Netherlands next week at 9 p.m. I will be going with my friends to that. A lot of the beer gardens and the usual suspects, so like Midlands, Atlas and Navy Yard, Wonder Garden, They're going to have the TVs locked and loaded and ready to go. The beer will be flowing. The food will be there for the eating. And you can just go out and watch.
Wait, let me ask you, as an observer of international football, as they call it, if you're like me and you approach this sort of as anthropology or cultural diplomacy, not more than sports, is there any team in the Women's World Cup, any country where the like cheering tradition is particularly like interesting, fun, colorful to be part of? That we, if you can catch a game by this country's team, you should do it. Is there anyone you would pick?
Ooh, that's a fabulous question. I'm not sure, but I know because Australia and New Zealand are hosting, and it's the first time anyone in that area has hosted the World Cup for the women, they are going to be going bananas. In terms of teams that I would root for, any of the first-time teams. So like the women's Filipino team, it's their first Women's World Cup ever. So if you're of Filipino descent, I would find your neighbors and find your fellow country humans and go absolutely wild and see if there are any traditions that are interesting or fun, because again, you only get your first time in the Women's World Cup once. So good time to do it.
Hey, Dan, who are you pulling for?
I'm pulling for, I go to bed at 10 o'clock. So this is not the year for me to get into soccer.
Oh no, I'm so sorry, Dan.
I'll have to wait until they come to this hemisphere.
Fair enough.
I'm with you on rooting for the first timers. The Philippines is cool.
Yeah.
I like Vietnam too.
Yeah, exactly. There's a chance, obviously, depending on which bracket they are in, they might get blown up by some of the more like powerhousey teams. So think like USA, Netherlands, England, those kind of teams. But again, we love an underdog story. I'd say root for them because the fans are going to be going nuts. Again, big fan of the underdogs.
Whoop, whoop.
Woohoo. All right. Dan Reed, thank you for being here, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Julia, always awesome to talk to you, especially about sports.
Thanks, Mike.
We do have a tip of the day, which we do on Fridays. We get tips from our listeners, from our guests, from our friends. Send them in to us if you can. Today, our tip is each recreation center in DC is different in the type of stuff they offer. Some have gym equipment like treadmills, exercise bikes, and weight machines, while others have free weights and squat racks. Sometimes there's a computer lab and a game room with ping pong, air hockey, pool table, or foosball. Nobody really tells you this stuff, so you kind of have to wander around and open doors to find it. So go to a rec center and explore.
Love that. Always down to explore if there's foosball and or air hockey and gym equipment.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. Our lead producer is Priyanka Tilve. Our producers are Julia Karron and Elizabeth Kama. Our newsletter writer is Kayla Cote-Stemmerman. Our production assistant is Susanna Brown. And our hosts are Bridget Todd and me, Michael Schaefer from Politico. Music is by Alex Roldan. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back Monday morning with more news from around the city. Bye.